The first snow came too early that year. A dusting of white lies on a land that was all hard. Brown truth. Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1874 was a place of broken promises. The summer had been a fist, clenched tight and hot, sucking the last moisture from the soil until the prairie grass was the color of old bone and cracked under a man's boot with a sound like a sigh. The creeks had dwindled to muddy trickles, and the wind, that ever-present preacher, spoke only of dust and endings. Now, the cold was setting in. Not the clean, honest cold of deep winter, but a bitter, grudging chill that found its way through every chink in a cabin wall and every worn thread in a man's coat. Eli Dawson felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the one in his heart. At 44, he was carved from the same unforgiving material as the land he worked. His face was a map of long days under a relentless sun. His hands knotted and scarred from rope and wood and the occasional foolishness of a cornered steer. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who lives alone, for whom there is no one to impress and no time to waste. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a small timber cabin and a sturdy barn standing as a defiant last word against the vast, empty scripture of the plains. He had a few dozen head of cattle, tough and lean like himself, and 2 good horses. It was not much, but it was his, and it was quiet. The quiet was what he had come for. After the war, after the noise of cannons and the screams that still echoed in the hollows of his memory, the silence of this place had been a balm. He had come west not seeking fortune, but forgetting. He had built his home with his own hands, felled the trees, chinked the logs, and in the sweat and strain of the labor, he had found a measure of peace. But solitude, like a slow-growing tree, casts a long shadow. There were nights when the wind sounded too much like a woman weeping, when the firelight danced on the empty chair across from his and carved shapes of things he had lost. He remembered Sarah, her face pale with the fever that had taken her years before the war had even begun, her hand growing cold in his. He remembered the faces of boys he had led into battle, their eyes wide with a terror he could do nothing to soothe. The memories were ghosts that sat with him at his table, drank from his cup, and lay down with him in the dark. He did not fight them. He had learned long ago that some ghosts you simply had to learn to live with. The town of Bitter Creek was 20 miles east, a journey he made only when necessity demanded it. It was a place of squinting eyes and sharp judgments, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the prairie wind. It was here, on a day when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, that Clara Mae Thompson stepped down from the stagecoach. She was a wraith in widow's weeds, her black dress dusty from the trail and her face so pale it seemed to have been scrubbed of all life. She moved with a brittle dignity, her back straight, her chin held at an angle that dared the world to strike it. But her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a grief so profound it seemed a wonder she could bear its weight. Her husband, a man named George Thompson, was 2 weeks in the ground. He had been a man of loud opinions and a quiet thirst, a thirst that had finally led him to an early grave. He had fallen from his horse in a drunken stupor and broken his neck. A simple tragedy, the kind that was common enough on the frontier. But the Thompson family, a clan as hard and unyielding as the rock formations north of town, would not have it so. They had never approved of Clara, a woman from the East with her quiet ways and her books. They whispered that she had driven him to it, that her coldness had been a poison in his cup. The whispers had found fertile ground in the bored and pious minds of Bitter Creek. When Clara walked down the main street toward the general store, curtains twitched. Women stopped their gossip to watch her pass, their eyes like pins. Men tipped their hats with a flicker of pity or something colder, something speculative. She felt their stares like a physical weight, another layer of shame to add to the one she already carried. George's family had given her an ultimatum. The farm was theirs. They said her presence was an offense to their son's memory. They gave her a pittance, enough for a stagecoach ticket to anywhere, and told her to be gone by the end of the week. She was 32 years old, with no family to return to, no prospects, and a name that was now stained with a lie she could not fight. She was adrift, a ship with no anchor in a hostile sea. It was desperation that made her stop before the notice board outside the Mercantile. Tacked between a reward poster for a bank robber and an advertisement for patent medicine was a piece of rough paper with carefully written words. Help wanted. Cook and housekeeper for remote ranch. Must be hardworking and of sober habits. Inquire of Eli Dawson at the store. The thought of putting herself under another man's roof, of being dependent on another man's charity or temper, made a cold dread coil in her stomach, but the alternative was worse. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed the worn fabric of her dress, and pushed open the door. The bell above it gave a small, apologetic jingle. Eli was at the counter, negotiating the price of a sack of flour with the proprietor. He turned as she entered, his eyes a clear, pale blue, taking her in with a neutral, assessing gaze. He saw the widow's dress, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, and the stubborn set of her jaw. He felt a familiar weariness. A woman meant complications. He had posted the notice out of a grudging admission that he could not cook a decent meal to save his life, and that the dust was winning a slow, inexorable war against his cabin. He had expected a grizzled old man, perhaps, or a desperate farm boy. Not this. Not a woman whose sorrow was so loud it filled the silence she brought with her. Clara approached the counter, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Dawson?" she asked, her voice lower than he expected, and steady. He gave a curt nod. I saw your notice. I am applying for the position." The storekeeper, a man with a ferret's face and an appetite for gossip, busied himself arranging tins on a shelf, his ears practically twitching. Eli's gaze did not waver from her face. "The work is hard. The ranch is a long way from anywhere. It is no place for a woman." It was not a question. It was a dismissal. "I am no stranger to hard work, sir," Clara replied, her voice remaining even. "And a long way from anywhere sounds preferable." The last word hung in the air between them, heavy with things unsaid. Eli looked at her then, truly looked. He saw past the grief to the steel beneath it. He saw the desperation in the slight tremor of her hands. But he also saw a profound and unyielding dignity. This was not a woman who would weep and wail and demand comforts he could not provide. This was a woman who had been pushed to the very edge of her world and had not fallen. He thought of his empty cabin, of the silence that was his companion. He did not know if he was ready to share it, but the look in her eyes was the look of a stray dog that had been kicked one too many times, a look that asked for nothing but a safe corner to lie down in. "Can you cook?" he asked, his tone rough. "I can." "Can you mend clothes and keep a place clean?" "I can." "I pay $10 a month, with board. You will have your own room. It is small." It was more of a warning than an offer. "That is acceptable," she said, a flicker of something like relief passing through her eyes. Eli held her gaze for a long moment longer, a silent battle of wills playing out over the dusty counter. Then he gave another short nod, as if surrendering to a fate he did not want but could not refuse. "My wagon is outside. I am leaving within the hour." He turned back to the storekeeper. "I will take the flour." Far to the south, in a county where the trees grew thicker and the rivers ran faster, another woman was running for her life. Mercy was 22, but a hard life had stolen the youth from her face, leaving behind a sharp, watchful intelligence and a fear that was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She was not a wife, not in any way that God or man would recognize. She was property, purchased from a father who had more daughters than he could feed and a love for the bottle that outweighed any love for his own flesh and blood. The man who had bought her, a trapper named Silas Kane, was a brute with a heavy hand and a soul as black as a rotten tooth. He called her his wife, but the word was a mockery, a chain he used to bind her to him. For 6 months, she had endured. She had learned the geography of his moods, the way a storm gathered in his eyes before it broke over her. She had learned to make herself small, to be silent, to anticipate his wants before he voiced them. But a part of her, a wild, unbroken core, refused to be extinguished. It was this part of her that planned, that watched, that waited for an opportunity. It came on a moonless night when Silas was deep in a drunken sleep, the cabin filled with the sound of his ragged snores, with a heart that hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Mercy slipped out of the bed. She took a loaf of bread, a skin of water, and a small, sharp knife from the kitchen. From Silas's trunk, she stole a pair of boy's trousers and a flannel shirt, clothing that would not mark her as a runaway woman. Her last act was one of desperate cunning. She took her oldest, most worn shawl, the one Silas had seen her in every day, and crept down to the river that ran swift and deep behind the cabin. She laid it on a rock at the water's edge, weighting it down with a stone, a silent testament to a tragic accident. Let them think she had drowned. Let them think the river had claimed her. A ghost could not be hunted. She saddled Silas's second horse, a skittish mare, her hands moving with a frantic, silent urgency. Then she was gone, melting into the pre-dawn darkness, heading west. The land was a terrifying, unknown expanse. Every snap of a twig was Silas's footstep. Every shadow was his hulking form. Fear was a constant companion, but determination was the fuel that drove her on. She rode hard, pushing the mare, pushing herself, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the life she had escaped. She was no one, heading nowhere, with nothing but a stolen horse and a fierce, desperate will to live. The first days at Eli's ranch passed in a haze of unspoken tension and shared labor. The cabin was even smaller than Clara had imagined. It was one main room, with a stone hearth at one end, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. Eli had partitioned off a corner for her with a thick wool blanket, creating a space that was hers alone. It was little more than a closet, with a narrow cot and a hook for her dress. But to Clara, it was a sanctuary. Their conversations were clipped and functional, orbiting the simple facts of their existence. The wood box is low. I will be back by sundown. Supper is at 6. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance. 2 solitary planets forced into a shared orbit. Clara learned the rhythm of his days, up before dawn. The smell of his coffee the first thing she noticed, out to the barn to tend the stock, then miles in the saddle checking fences or moving the cattle to better pasture. He worked with a tireless, methodical pace, as if the physical labor could keep the ghosts at bay. She, in turn, transformed the cabin. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows until the pale autumn light could find its way in, and cooked meals that were simple but nourishing. The smell of baking bread began to replace the stale scent of loneliness. Eli never commented on the changes, but he ate every scrap of food she put on his plate and started wiping his boots more carefully before coming inside. They were small things, but in the vast silence of their lives, they were a language all their own. Slowly, like a frozen river thawing from the edges, trust began to form. It began with her asking about the cattle, and him answering with more than a single word. It grew when he brought her a small basket of wild plums he had found by the creek, setting them on the table without a word. One evening, as she was washing the dishes, she began to speak, her voice soft, almost a whisper. She told him about George, not the lie the town believed, but the truth of him. She spoke of his charm that could curdle into cruelty in the space of a heartbeat, of the promises that turned to dust in her hands. She spoke of the loneliness of being married to a man whose only real love was the bottle. He was not a bad man, she said, her hands still in the soapy water. He was just weak, and his family could never forgive me for seeing it. She did not cry. Her voice was flat, depleted of all emotion. as if she were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. Eli sat at the table, sharpening a knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound for a long time after she fell silent. He did not offer sympathy or judgment. He just listened. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Some people need someone to blame. It is easier than looking at the truth. It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. It was enough. The night she finally broke, it was over something small. She was mending one of his work shirts by the fire. The fabric was rough under her fingers, the tear a ragged wound. She thought of all the things in her life that were torn and could not be mended, of the dreams she had carefully folded away like fine linen, only to find them yellowed and frayed when she dared to look at them again. A single tear escaped and fell onto the back of her hand. Then another. Soon, a silent, steady stream was coursing down her face. She kept her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with the force of her contained sobs, hoping he would not notice in the dim light. Eli sat in his chair, watching the fire. He saw the tremble in her shoulders, heard the small, choked breaths. His first instinct was to say nothing, to pretend he had not noticed, to grant her the privacy of her grief. It was what he would have wanted, but then he saw her draw her thin shawl tighter around herself, as if to ward off a chill that came from within. The memory of Sarah, shivering with fever, flashed through his mind. He got up from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak. He walked to the wood box, picked up a fresh log, and placed it carefully on the fire. Then he picked up the small stool that he used to pull off his boots and set it down on the hearth, much closer to the flames. He nudged it with his foot, a small gesture of invitation. Then he returned to his chair and picked up a book, his eyes on the page, but his attention on the weeping woman. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply offered her a place closer to the fire. For Clara, who had felt so cold for so long, it was the kindest gesture she had ever known. She moved to the stool, the warmth of the flames a comfort on her tear-stained face, and continued to mend his shirt, her grief slowly subsiding into a quiet, aching sorrow. That night, as Eli lay on his cot, the wind howling outside, the ghosts were more restless than usual. He saw the flash of cannon fire against a dark sky, heard the terrible, high-pitched scream of a horse in its death throes. He felt the phantom weight of a rifle in his hands and the sick, hollow feeling of taking a life. He had been a good soldier. He had followed orders. He had survived. But survival had a cost, one he paid every night in the currency of his dreams. He saw Sarah's face, not as she had been in life, vibrant and laughing, but as she was at the end, her eyes too large in her thin face, her breath a shallow whisper. He had held her hand, helpless, as she slipped away from him. He had learned then that love was just another word for loss. He had built this solitary life as a fortress to protect himself from it ever happening again. Now, there was another woman sleeping just a few feet away. A woman with sorrow in her eyes that he recognized as a countryman recognizes a fellow exile, and he felt the walls of his fortress begin to crack. Across the wild, frozen land, Mercy pushed on. The stolen mare was failing, and the food was long gone. The boy's clothes were thin protection against a wind that carried the promise of a blizzard. She was lost, hungry, and so cold her thoughts were becoming slow and sluggish. The determination that had been a fire in her belly was now just a few dying embers. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not go back. As the first thick flakes of snow began to fall, obscuring the world in a swirling curtain of white, the mare finally stumbled and would not get up. Mercy slid from its back, her legs too numb to hold her. She pushed forward on foot, stumbling through the deepening drifts, the world a white, featureless blur. She thought of the river, of the shawl she had left on the rock. Perhaps it would have been better that way, she thought, a quick end in the cold water. She took another step, and then another, before her strength gave out completely. She fell into the snow, the cold a merciful blanket, and the white world went dark. She had collapsed less than 100 yards from Eli Dawson's property line. The world had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, the wind a ravenous beast clawing at the logs, its howl a constant, maddening sermon. The snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, erasing the land, the sky, everything but the immediate, desperate present. Eli had been checking the livestock in the barn, the short journey from the cabin a battle against the elements. It was on his return, during a momentary lull when the wind held its breath, that he saw it, a dark shape against the impossible white, a smudge on a clean page, just beyond his fence line. It was small, unmoving, and already succumbing to the accumulating drifts. He did not call out to Clara. He did not pause to think. He simply pulled his hat down, turned his collar up, and plunged back into the storm. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Every step was a fight against a wind that sought to push him back, to trip him, to lay him down in the snow beside the shape he was pushing toward. When he reached it, he saw it was a horse, down on its side, its life already a frozen statue, and curled beside it, a human form, so covered in snow it was barely a mound. He fell to his knees, his hands raw with cold as he brushed the snow away. He found a face, blue-lipped and still, framed by dark, wet hair. It was a girl, a child almost, dressed in the rough clothes of a boy. For a heartbeat, his own heart stopped. He had seen death in every form imaginable, on frozen battlefields and in dusty clearings. But the sight of this fragile life, so close to being extinguished by the indifferent cruelty of the plains, struck a chord of pure, primal fury in him. He would not let this happen. Not here, not on his land. With a grunt of effort, he scooped the girl into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of cold limbs and wet wool. He turned his back to the wind and began the slow, torturous journey back to the cabin. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he did not falter. The small weight in his arms was a terrible and profound responsibility. Clara saw him through the window as he staggered toward the door, a dark figure wrestling a burden through the white chaos. She threw the door open, the wind snatching it from her hand and slamming it against the inside wall. Eli stumbled over the threshold and nearly fell, the girl in his arms a dead weight. "Dear God, Eli!" Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "She is alive," he said, his voice a ragged rasp. "Barely. Get blankets and heat water." He carried the girl to the hearth and laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the fire. She looked like a drowned thing, her clothes soaked through, her skin a waxy, translucent white. Clara was already moving, her actions swift and certain. She stripped the wet, boyish clothes from the girl's frail body with a practiced efficiency that spoke of long nights tending to the sick. She wrapped the girl in the warmest wool blankets they owned, chafing her frozen hands and feet, her touch firm but gentle. Eli kept the fire roaring, the heat a welcome roar against the storm outside. The presence of this stranger, this near-dead girl on their hearth, shattered the fragile, quiet rhythm of their lives. The cabin, which had felt spacious for two solitary souls, now seemed impossibly small, crowded with the unspoken questions that hung in the air. Who was she? Where had she come from? What tragedy had thrown her into the heart of a blizzard on their doorstep? They worked in tandem, their previous caution with each other forgotten in the face of this immediate, life-or-death task. Clara was no longer just the hired cook. She was a woman of deep, untapped strength. And Eli was no longer just the reclusive rancher. He was a protector, a guardian. For 2 days, the girl did not wake. She drifted in a fevered state, muttering words too broken to understand, her body shivering and then burning with a dry heat. Clara tended to her relentlessly. She spooned warm broth between her lips, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, and sat with her through the long, dark hours of the night, The only sounds, the howl of the wind and the girl's ragged breathing. Eli watched from a distance, feeling a strange mixture of awe and helplessness. He saw in Clara a tenderness and a resolve he had not suspected. He felt like an intruder in the scene, a large, clumsy animal in a sick room. His role was to provide wood for the fire, to hunt for what little game had not yet hunkered down, to keep the machinery of their survival running while Clara fought for the girl's life. On the third morning, the blizzard broke. The world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white under a sky of pale, washed-out blue. And inside, the girl's eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a doe's, wide and dark, and filled with a terror so profound it was almost wild. She flinched when she saw Clara leaning over her, and her gaze darted around the cabin, taking in the strange room, the stone hearth, the tall, bearded man standing near the door. "You are safe," Clara said, her voice soft and soothing. "You were caught in the storm. We found you." The girl's eyes fixed on Eli, and the fear in them sharpened. She tried to push herself up, a raw panic in her movements. "Easy now," Clara said, gently pushing her back down. "You have been very ill. You need to rest." The girl swallowed, her throat working. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "My name is Clara Thompson. This is Mr. Dawson's ranch. What is your name, child?" The girl's eyes flickered away, a shudder coming down, her mind racing. The truth was a weapon that could be used against her. The truth would send her back to Silas. She needed a new truth, a new story. "Anna," she said, the name coming to her from a half-remembered storybook. "Annabelle Carter." She pushed herself up on one elbow, the effort making her dizzy. "My husband, he passed. I was on my way to my sister's in Oregon. My horse gave out." The lie came easily. A well-rehearsed performance for an audience of one. She was a widow, a victim of tragedy. It was the only story the world seemed to accept from a woman alone. Clara's expression softened with a deep, sorrowful empathy. "Another widow," she said softly, more to herself than to the girl. "The world is hard on us." From that moment on, the girl they knew as Anna became a permanent disruption. She was not a pliant, grateful patient. As her strength returned, so did a sharp, defensive edge. She was quick-tongued and watchful, her eyes missing nothing. She moved with the cautious grace of a wild thing, always aware of the exits, always keeping her back to a wall. She ate with a ravenous hunger that spoke of long-term deprivation. But she spoke little, answering questions with clipped, evasive replies. The trauma she carried was most evident at night. Clara had given the girl her own cot behind the blanket partition, taking a place for herself on a pallet by the fire. More than once, they were jolted awake by a muffled scream from behind the curtain. Eli would sit up, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept by his bed, his heart pounding with the echoes of old battles. Clara would rush to the cot to find the girl thrashing in her sleep, her face a mask of terror. One night, Clara found her clutching the small knife she had used to peel potatoes earlier, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with a blind, sleeping panic. Clara gently pried the knife from her grasp, her heart aching for the unknown horrors that haunted this child's dreams. Clara found herself torn. She was wary of the girl's guardedness, of the lies she suspected were woven into her simple story. The girl, Anna, was so young, barely a woman, yet there was a hardness in her that was unsettling. But then Clara would catch a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath the armor, a flash of pure terror in her eyes when Eli moved too quickly or spoke too loud, and she would see a mirror of her own wounds. She saw a girl who had been broken by the world and was trying to piece herself back together with shards of anger and fear. For Eli, the situation was a constant, low-grade torment. He felt a fierce, protective instinct toward both women. He saw their fragility, their resilience, and the injustice that had driven them to his door. But he was acutely aware of the precariousness of their situation. A man living alone with two women, neither of them kin. was a story that the gossips in Bitter Creek would feast upon. He was a man who had spent years cultivating his solitude, and now his cabin was filled with the soft rustle of skirts, the scent of lavender soap, and the low murmur of female voices after he had gone to bed. He felt like a bear in a dollhouse, clumsy and out of place. He retreated further into himself, keeping his distance, his words few, his gaze often fixed on the distant horizon, as if he could will the snow to melt and the complication to ride away. He was not afraid of the town's judgment for his own sake, but for theirs. He could not bear the thought of his presence bringing them any more shame than they already carried. The winter locked them in its icy embrace. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a pale, indifferent sun. Their lives became a closed loop of survival. Eli hunted, his rifle shots echoing in the vast, white silence. He and Clara worked together to repair a section of the barn roof that had been damaged in the storm, their hands sometimes brushing, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through the frozen air. Mercy, for in the privacy of her own thoughts, she was still Mercy, learned to do her share. She learned to bake bread, to mend clothes with small, neat stitches, and to pluck a grouse until her fingers were numb with cold. In the long evenings, they huddled around the fire, the cabin their entire world. The enforced intimacy began to wear down their defenses. The silence, which had at first been tense and awkward, gradually became comfortable, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. And in that quiet, desire, like a seed buried under the snow, began to stir. It was a thing of glances and small gestures, as sharp and fragile as an icicle. Mercy would watch Clara brush the snow from Eli's coat when he came in from the cold, her touch lingering for a fraction of a second on the rough wool of his shoulder. She saw the way Clara's hands, so capable and sure when she was kneading dough, trembled almost imperceptibly. Mercy, who had known only the brutal, grasping touch of a man, watched this quiet, respectful care with a painful, yearning fascination. Clara, in turn, noticed the way Eli's gaze would sometimes rest on Mercy. He would watch as the firelight caught the red highlights in her dark hair, or as she argued fiercely with him over the right way to stack firewood, her face alive with a fire he had thought long extinguished in himself. It was not a lustful look. It was one of reluctant awe, the look of a man seeing a wildflower pushing its way through a rock. Clara felt a pang, not of simple jealousy, but of a more complex and sorrowful emotion. It was the ache of a woman who had forgotten what it was to be that young, that unbroken, that fierce. The conversation started to deepen. One night, as Eli was oiling a piece of tack, he spoke of the war, not of the battles, but of the shame of it, of turning boys into killers and calling it duty. "The world finds a way of making a weapon out of a man," he said, his voice low and rough, his eyes on his work. "And it is a hard thing to learn how to be just a man again afterward." Clara, darning a sock, looked up. "It does the same to women," she replied, her voice quiet but clear. "It turns us into property, into servants, into saints or sinners. It makes us into anything but ourselves." Mercy, who had been staring into the flames, spoke without looking at them. "It turns us into lies," she said, her voice bitter. "That is what we become, a story we tell so we can survive." The truth of her words hung in the small cabin, raw and undeniable. They were three survivors, each carrying a different version of the same shame, each telling a different lie to stay alive. The breaking point came during another storm, a lesser one this time. That rattled the windows and sent drafts of cold air snaking across the floor. Eli was in the barn, tending to a sick calf. Inside, the atmosphere was close and charged. Mercy had been quiet all day, a restless, coiled energy coming off her in waves. Clara, sensing the girl's distress, finally sat down beside her at the table. "What is it, Anna?" she asked gently. "What troubles you so?" Mercy shook her head, her jaw tight. But Clara did not press. She simply waited. Finally, with a ragged sob that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of her, the girl's story came pouring out, the carefully constructed lie of Annabelle Carter, the grieving widow, crumbled, and the raw, ugly truth of Mercy, the sold girl, was laid bare. She told of her father, of Silas Kane, of the escape, of the shawl left by the river. She spoke of the constant, gnawing fear of being found, of being dragged back to a life that was worse than death. When she finished, she was trembling, her face buried in her hands, expecting disgust, judgment, perhaps even fear. Instead, she felt Clara's arms go around her. Clara did not speak. She simply held the weeping girl, rocking her gently as if she were a child. She held her with the complete and devastating understanding of a woman who also knew what it was to be trapped, to be shamed, to be erased by the will of a man. In that moment, they were not the widow and the runaway. They were simply two women, their sorrows merging in the warm, quiet dark. Later that night, the emotional storm that had broken inside the cabin had not subsided. Clara felt raw, exposed, her own grief and anger stirred up by Mercy's confession. A terrible loneliness, the kind she had kept at bay with routine and hard work, washed over her. She did not know what she needed. She pulled on a shawl and went out to the barn, telling Mercy she was going to check on Eli and the calf. The barn was warmer than the outside, filled with the sweet, earthy smell of hay and animals. A single lantern cast a pool of golden light, pushing back the deep shadows. Eli was on his knees beside the calf, murmuring to it in a low, soothing voice. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with weariness in the lantern light.
"How is he?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He will make it, I think," Eli replied, getting slowly to his feet. "He is a fighter." They stood in silence for a long moment. The sounds of the barn all around them, the shared intimacy of the past weeks, the confessions whispered by the fire, the life or death struggle for the girl sleeping in the cabin, it all converged in that small, warm space. Clara looked at his face, at the kindness and the sorrow in his eyes, at the strength in his hands. He was a good man, a decent man, and he was as lonely as she was. Before she could think, before she could lose her nerve, she stepped forward and closed the distance between them. She reached up, her hand cool on his rough, whiskered cheek, and she kissed him. It was not a soft or gentle kiss. It was hesitant, desperate, and raw with all the unspoken grief and longing she had carried for so long. It was the kiss of a drowning woman reaching for a lifeline. For a second, his whole body went rigid. He resisted, his hands coming up as if to push her away. But they stopped, hovering in the air between them. He did not push her away. Instead, a low groan escaped his throat, a sound of profound and sorrowful surrender. His hands came to rest on her waist, his touch uncertain, and he returned the kiss, his mouth as hungry and as desperate as hers. Neither of them saw the small figure standing in the deep shadow of the barn doorway. Mercy, drawn by a need to not be alone, had followed Clara. She saw it all, the step forward, the hesitant touch, the meeting of their mouths. She saw them clinging to each other in the lantern light, two lonely people finding a moment of solace. But to Mercy, it looked like a closing of a door. It looked like the world she had just begun to trust solidifying into a shape that had no place for her. A familiar, cold dread filled her. She was the outsider, the third person, the one who would be left behind. Without a sound, she turned and fled, not back to the warm cabin, but out into the swirling snow and the vast, unforgiving night. The kiss shattered as the cold reality of the barn rushed back in. Eli broke away first, a look of profound shock on his face, as if he had just woken from a dream. Clara's lips were still tingling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. the moment of connection, so raw and real, evaporated into a cloud of confusion and regret. They stood there, a few feet apart in the lantern light, the space between them humming with everything that had just happened and everything that could not be said.
Clara,
Eli began, his voice a low rasp, but he could not finish. He ran a hand through his hair, turning away from her to look at the shadows. It was the sound that brought them back to the world, or rather, the lack of it. The wind still moaned outside, but the familiar, gentle presence of the calf was gone. The barn door, which had been slightly ajar, was now swinging gently in the draft. A sudden, sharp, and inexplicable fear seized Clara.
Mercy,
she whispered, her voice tight.
She said she was coming to check on you.
Eli spun around, his eyes wide with the same dawning horror. He strode to the door and looked out into the swirling darkness. The small footprints leading from the cabin were already beginning to disappear under a fresh dusting of snow, but they did not lead back to the house. They led away, into the night. "Fool girl," Eli growled, a sound that was more fear than anger. He grabbed the lantern from its hook. "Stay inside. Keep the fire high."
"I am coming with you,"
Clara said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She was already pulling her thickest shawl from a peg by the door. The guilt that struck her was a physical blow, so sharp it stole her breath. Mercy had seen them. That had to be it. She had seen that moment of desperate comfort and mistaken it for an alliance, a closing of ranks that left her out in the cold, literally and figuratively. They plunged into the night, the single lantern a small, defiant star against the overwhelming darkness. The wind cut through their clothes, and the snow stung their faces. "Mercy!" Eli bellowed, his voice snatched away by the storm. "Mercy!" Clara's own calls were thinner, a reedy counterpoint to his roar. They followed the tracks, a fragile thread leading them away from the safety of the ranch. The girl was not running aimlessly. She was heading toward the creek, a dark, churning ribbon of water that was the lifeblood of this valley in the summer, but a treacherous hazard in the winter. Panic began to claw at Clara's throat. She remembered Mercy's story, the shawl left by the river, the faked drowning. Was she trying to disappear again, this time for good? They found her by the water's edge, huddled at the base of a large cottonwood, its bare branches clawing at the sky. She had stumbled and fallen, and she was not moving. The snow was already gathering on her shoulders, a premature shroud. Eli reached her first. He dropped to his knees, holding the lantern high. Her face was ashen, her lips tinged with blue. He pressed his fingers to her neck, his touch surprisingly gentle. For a terrible, eternal second, there was nothing. Then, he felt it, a faint, thready pulse. "She is alive?" he said, the words a prayer of relief. He gathered her into his arms for the second time in her short, tumultuous life on his ranch. She was a frozen, brittle weight. Clara walked beside him on the slow, agonizing journey back, her hand on Mercy's arm, as if she could will her own warmth into the girl's frozen limbs. Back in the cabin, they worked with a grim, silent efficiency. They stripped her of her wet clothes and wrapped her in a cocoon of warm blankets, placing her on the rug before the fire. The scene was a terrifying echo of the first time they had brought her in. But this time it was different. This was not the act of strangers saving a stranger. This was their fault. As the warmth slowly seeped back into Mercy's body, her shivering began, a violent, uncontrollable rattling that shook her entire frame. Clara held her, trying to still the tremors, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort. Eli stood by, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a turbulent mixture of guilt and a fierce, helpless anger. When the shivering finally subsided and Mercy fell into an exhausted, shallow sleep, Clara looked up at Eli, her eyes blazing in the firelight. "We have to talk to her," she said, her voice low and intense. "When she wakes, We have to tell her the truth." "The truth of what?" Eli asked, his voice rough. "That we are two fools who forgot ourselves for a moment."
"No,"
Clara said, shaking her head.
"the truth that she belongs here, that she is not a burden, that what she saw, it was not what she thinks."
Her voice broke on the last words.
"I made her feel excluded. I made her feel like an outsider in the one place she might have felt safe. After everything she told me, how could I have been so cruel?"
There was no jealousy in her voice, only a profound and bottomless guilt. She was not angry at Eli, or at the kiss. She was angry at herself for failing this wounded girl who had trusted her with her story. When Mercy woke hours later, the storm had passed and a watery morning light was filtering through the window. She was in Eli's bed, tucked under a mountain of blankets. Eli sat in his chair, watching her, his face grim. Clara was on a stool beside the bed, her expression one of weary tenderness. Mercy's first instinct was to flinch away, to retreat into a sullen, protective silence. But Clara spoke before she could.
"Mercy," she said,
using the girl's real name for the first time.
The sound of it, spoken aloud in this place, was a shock. "I am so sorry. What you saw in the barn, it was a moment of weakness, of loneliness. It was not about choosing him over you. It was never that."
Mercy stared at her, her dark eyes wide and unreadable.
"This is my fault,"
Clara continued, her voice thick with emotion.
"I knew how you felt. I knew you were afraid of being cast out. I should have been more careful with you, with your heart, or—"
Eli cleared his throat, and both women looked at him.
"The fault is mine,"
he said, his voice low and heavy.
"This is my house. You are both under my protection. I failed in that."
He looked at Mercy, his pale blue eyes direct and filled with a regret so deep it was startling.
"I would never, ever, let any harm come to you, and I would never send you away."
The honesty in the room was a palpable thing, as thick and as warm as the air from the hearth. It was terrifying and disarming. Mercy had expected anger, accusations, or worse, a cold dismissal. She had not expected this. She had not expected them to claim her, to wrap her in their shared guilt and concern. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Clara reached out and wiped it away with her thumb. Then, with a tenderness that brought a fresh wave of tears to the girl's eyes, Clara began to brush her still damp hair, her long, slow strokes a soothing rhythm. Eli rose and came back from the hearth with a steaming mug of broth, holding it out to her. "Drink this," he said gruffly. "You need your strength." Mercy took the mug, her cold fingers wrapping around the welcome warmth. She sipped the broth, the salty, savory liquid a balm to her frozen insides. She looked from Clara's gentle face to Eli's stern, concerned one. The mood in the cabin had shifted, the sharp edges of guilt and fear dissolving into something else, something warm and confusing and deeply intimate. It was a current of unspoken longing that flowed between all three of them, a tangled web of need and protection and a desire so new and unnamed they did not know what to do with it. In the days that followed, Eli tried to retreat. He put the emotional distance back between them, his conversations once again becoming clipped and functional. He threw himself into his work, staying out on the range from sunup to sundown, returning to the cabin only when exhaustion drove him in. He saw himself as a tarnished man, a man whose hands were stained with the violence of his past. He had lost one wife to sickness, a gentle soul he had been unable to protect. What right did he have to these two women, both of them survivors of their own wars? He felt a desperate, clawing need to protect them, to keep them safe, but he also felt a deep, abiding shame for the desire that was growing in him. To want Clara, with her quiet strength and her sorrowful eyes, seemed a betrayal of his memories of Sarah. To feel a reluctant awe for Mercy's fierce, untamed spirit felt like a violation of the girl's trust. To want them both was a sin so profound he could not even give it a name. He was unworthy of either, let alone the impossible, unthinkable both. But while Eli built his walls higher, Clara and Mercy began to tear theirs down. The shared crisis of that night had forged a new and powerful bond between them. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, complementary rhythm. Clara, with her patient guidance, taught Mercy how to read, her finger tracing the words in an old Bible by the firelight. Mercy, in turn, with her sharp eyes, showed Clara where to find the first wild onions of the spring, pushing up through the melting snow. They talked for hours, their voices a low murmur that became the new soundtrack of the cabin. Mercy spoke of her childhood, of the small joys and the crushing poverty. Clara spoke of her life in the East, of her love for books and music, dreams she had thought long buried. They bridged the decade that separated them, finding common ground in their shared experience of a world that had tried to define them, to own them, to break them. They found in each other a sister, a mother, a daughter, a friend. They became a unit, a force of two that Eli, in his self-imposed exile, could only watch from the outside. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire, the silence was different. It was not Eli's tense, withdrawn silence, but a deep, contemplative quiet. It was Clara who finally broke it. "Eli," she said, her voice soft but clear, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up. She was looking into the fire, her profile illuminated by the flames. Mercy sat on the floor beside her, leaning against her knees, her gaze also fixed on the fire. "I have been thinking," Clara said slowly, choosing her words with care, "about us, about this world. It gives us so few choices. It tells us there is only one way to live, one way to love. It tells us a woman belongs to one man, and a man to one woman. It draws lines and builds fences and calls it righteousness." She paused, turning her head to look at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "But what if that is not the only truth? What if we have been so afraid of what is wrong that we have forgotten to ask what is right for us? Here, now." She looked from Eli to Mercy, whose eyes were now fixed on her, wide and questioning. What if we stopped pretending love only looks one way? The question hung in the air, audacious and revolutionary. It was not a proposition. It was an opening. A door pushed slightly ajar into a room they had all been too afraid to even look at. Eli said nothing. He had no answer. The question was a seed planted in the hard, frozen ground of his convictions. He got up abruptly and went outside, needing the cold night air to clear his head. He returned an hour later, the inner turmoil still raging within him. He pushed open the cabin door, expecting to find them both asleep. The difficult conversation postponed for another day, but they were not asleep. They were sitting on his narrow bed, waiting for him. The fire had been banked, casting the room in a soft, flickering glow. They were not touching, but sat side by side, their hands folded in their laps. They were both still fully dressed. There was nothing seductive in their posture. It was an attitude of quiet, patient waiting. It was not a demand. It was an invitation, an offering. They looked at him, their expressions open, vulnerable, and filled with a breathless trust that terrified him more than any army ever had. The sight broke something inside him. All the walls he had so carefully constructed, all the shame and guilt and fear he had carried for so long, came crashing down. A sound, a terrible, ragged sob, was torn from his chest. He leaned against the doorframe, his broad shoulders shaking, and he wept. He wept for Sarah, for the men he had lost, for the loneliness that had been his only companion for so long. He wept for the profound, undeserved grace of these two women. Clara and Mercy rose from the bed and came to him. They did not speak. Clara placed a hand on his arm. Mercy gently took his hand. They led him to the hearth, to his chair, and knelt before him. "I am ashamed," he whispered, the words ragged and broken. He could not look at them. "I am so ashamed.
of how much I want you both, of how wrong it feels. A man like me. Clara reached up and gently tilted his chin, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her voice was steady and clear. "Then let it be wrong together," she said simply. Mercy, her hand still holding his, squeezed it gently. "We are all broken, Eli," she whispered. "Maybe we can be broken together." He looked from one face to the other, from Clara's gentle strength to Mercy's fierce vulnerability. He saw no judgment, no fear. He saw only acceptance. He saw a love that was bigger and wilder than any he had ever known. A love that did not fit into the neat boxes the world had made. That night, they crossed a line. It was not a fall into sin, but a step into grace. It was done not with recklessness, but with a quiet, trembling reverence. In the soft firelight, there were no demands, only offerings. The slow, deliberate unbuttoning of his shirt, a baring of the chest that carried so many scars, both visible and invisible. A sharp, caught breath as his hand, rough and calloused, gently traced the line of Clara's jaw. A single tear that fell from Mercy's eye, a tear of fear and hope and release that was kissed away from her cheek by Clara's soft lips. It was a silent, holy communion of three wounded souls, finding in each other a solace they had never thought to know. It was a hunger born not of the flesh, but of a profound and desperate loneliness, a need to be seen, to be held, to be known, to be safe. Afterward, they lay together in the narrow bed, the fire burning down to embers. They did not speak. The silence was filled with the enormity of what they had done. They were three separate heartbeats in the quiet dark, terrified and comforted in equal measure, adrift together on a new and uncharted sea. The dawn broke gray and unforgiving, leaking a pale, watery light into the cabin that seemed to touch everything with a chill. The ashes in the hearth were a dead, soft gray, and the silence in the room was a fourth presence, heavy and suffocating. Last night's reverence had curdled into this morning's raw, awkward reality. They had woken tangled together in the narrow bed, a confusing warmth that had instantly evaporated the moment their eyes opened and memory returned. Clara was the first to move, with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied the turmoil in her heart. She slipped from the bed, careful not to disturb the others. She dressed quickly in the semi-darkness, her movements stiff and overly precise. Without a word, she pulled on her shawl, took the bucket, and went out to feed the hens. Her escape into the familiar ritual of chores, a desperate flight from the emotional chaos inside the cabin. Mercy was next. She did not get up, but curled into a tight ball on the edge of the bed, her back to Eli, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She would not, could not, meet his eyes. The vulnerability of the night before had been replaced by a familiar, protective shell. Her world had been turned upside down, and she did not know the rules of this new landscape. Silence and stillness were her only defenses. Eli lay there for a long time, the weight of his decision, of their shared transgression, pressing down on him like a physical stone. He was a simple man, guided by a simple code. He had broken it. He had taken advantage of their loneliness, their desperation. He was the man, the protector. He should have been stronger. The shame he had confessed last night had returned, tenfold. In the harsh light of day, he finally rose, his movements slow and heavy, like those of an old man. He pulled on his trousers and shirt, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He looked at the small, fierce knot of Mercy on the bed, her rejection a sharp pain in his chest. He felt a desperate need to fix what he had broken. He approached the bed, his shadow falling over her. "Mercy," he began, his voice a low rumble. She flinched but did not turn. He did not know what to say. "I am sorry," he finally managed, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. "For last night, it should not have happened. The fault is mine." Before he could say more,
The cabin door opened and Clara came back inside, a blast of cold air following her. She set the bucket of eggs on the table with a firm thud and turned to face him, her eyes clear and direct. Though her face was pale, she had heard his apology. "Do not," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that stopped him cold. She walked toward him, her gaze unwavering. "Do not you dare apologize. Do not diminish what happened by calling it a mistake." She stopped in front of him, so close he could see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. "Last night was not a sin, Eli, it was a prayer in the dark. It was 3 people who have been starved for a scrap of kindness and warmth finding it in each other." She glanced over at the still form on the bed. "Do not apologize for needing what we all needed." Her words were a release, a reframing of the shame into something else, something necessary and human. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. He looked at Clara, at her fierce, unwavering belief, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe what felt like a fall had actually been a step toward solid ground. From the bed, Mercy slowly, cautiously, uncurled. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, her dark eyes moving between the two of them. She did not speak, but she was listening, the hard shell of her fear beginning to crack. The rhythm they found after that morning was fragile, a new melody they were learning by heart, note by painful, hesitant note. It was a rhythm built not in the shadows of the night, but in the full light of day. The affection between them grew not in secret touches, but in small, public acts of care. It was in the way Eli would place a hand on Mercy's shoulder to steady her as she climbed down from the hayloft. It was in the way Mercy would save the last piece of cornbread for him. It was in the way Clara would mend a tear in his shirt, her head bent close to Mercy's as the younger woman practiced her letters. Their shared concentration a quiet intimacy. They did not speak of that night again, but it was a constant, unspoken presence, a new foundation beneath their feet. When the nights turned bitter cold with the threat of a late spring blizzard, they started sleeping in the same room, eventually sharing the bed again. It was not always born of passion. More often, it was an act of simple, profound closeness, a huddling together for warmth against the vast, cold loneliness of the world outside their cabin walls. They were 3 islands that had, against all odds, become an archipelago, connected by invisible bridges of shared sorrow and a strange, new, and terrifying hope. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. As the snows melted and the trails to Bitter Creek became passable again, their isolation was breached. The first sign of trouble was a change in the air when Eli went to town for supplies. The usual gruff greetings from the men on the boardwalk were replaced by a stony silence. The women who had once nodded to him now turned their faces away, ushering their children inside as he passed. The storekeeper, who had always been ready with a piece of gossip, now served him with a cold, tight-lipped efficiency. Word had spread, carried on the wind like a foul seed. The whispers started in the church, in the saloon, over clotheslines and fences. Eli Dawson, that quiet, solitary man, had taken in the Thompson widow. And now there was another one, a young girl, a stranger. The math was simple, and the conclusion was ugly. The story took root and grew into a monstrous shape. He was a man of sin, and his remote ranch was a den of iniquity where he was harboring whores. The whispers finally took on a physical form. One afternoon, a wagon rattled up the path to the cabin. In it were Clara's brothers-in-law, Samuel and Thomas Thompson, their faces set in grim, righteous lines. Samuel, the elder, was a stout man with a preacher's booming voice and the cold, unforgiving eyes of a zealot. Eli met them on the porch, his stance wide, his hands loose at his sides. He was not armed, but he was a wall they would not easily pass. Clara and Mercy stood in the doorway behind him, Mercy half hidden, her eyes wide with fear. "Dawson," Samuel boomed, remaining in the wagon as if the very ground of the ranch was tainted. We have come for what is ours.
There is nothing here that belongs to you, Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble.
We have come for our brother's widow,
Samuel declared, his gaze fixing on Clara with a look of pure contempt.
And we have come for his property,
which this woman stole when she fled our charity? The silver-backed mirror, the porcelain clock. We have a list. I took nothing but my own clothes and the small amount of money you saw fit to grant me, Clara said, her voice trembling but clear. The mirror and clock were my mother's.
Lies and sin,
Samuel spat. You will come with us, Clara. We will see you placed in a home where your moral character can be mended.
And you,
he said, turning his venom on Eli, will be reported to the sheriff. We will not have this filth in our county. You will leave, Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. Now, and you will not come back. There was a finality in his tone, a promise of violence held in check by a thread that even Samuel Thompson could not ignore. With a final curse, he snapped the reins, and the wagon turned and rumbled away, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred in its wake. The second blow came a week later. A man on a big roan horse rode up to the cabin. He was a stranger, tall and gaunt, with a long, drooping mustache and eyes that were as cold and dead as river stones. He dismounted with a weary creak of leather and introduced himself as Jedediah Kane. He said he was a bounty hunter.
I am looking for a runaway,
he said, his eyes scanning the cabin, lingering on the two women who stood on the porch with Eli. A girl named Mercy stole a horse and some clothes from her husband, Silas Kane. There is a reward. Mercy went rigid, all the color draining from her face. She felt as if a hand had reached inside her chest and squeezed her heart. Kane's dead eyes settled on her. He had seen the flash of recognition, the terror she could not hide. Well now, he said slowly, a cruel smile touching his lips. It is the eyes. I would know those eyes anywhere. Silas said you probably drowned. Looks like he was wrong. Eli stepped in front of Mercy, shielding her with his body. There is no one here by that name, he said. Kane chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Friend, he said, do not play me for a fool. I have a writ here, signed by a judge. The girl is property. I mean to collect her.
You will collect nothing here but trouble,
Eli warned, his hand moving to rest on the axe handle that was propped against the cabin wall. The bounty hunter looked from Eli's resolute face to the two women behind him, then back again. He was one man, and he was not a fool. He shrugged. Have it your way. But the law is the law. The sheriff will be interested to hear about this. He will be very interested to hear about all of this. He swung himself back onto his horse and rode away, whistling a tuneless, cheerful dirge. Sheriff Brody arrived 2 days later. He was a big, weary man with a drooping mustache and a tarnished star pinned to his vest. He was a man who preferred peace to justice and order to morality. He came alone, a sign that this was not yet an official arrest. He sat at their table, Clara having offered him coffee, which he accepted. He took in the clean, orderly cabin, the two women who moved with a quiet dignity, and the hard, watchful man who stood by the hearth. This did not look like the den of sin he had been hearing about, but the complaints had been lodged. The bounty hunter had shown him the writ. His hand had been forced. Eli, he said, stirring his coffee, I am in a difficult position. The Thompson family is pressing charges of theft. This man Kane has a legal claim for the return of the girl. He cleared his throat, the words tasting foul even to him. And the whole town is in an uproar. They are talking about a lynch mob if I do not do something. They say you are living here in sin with these two women. He looked up, his eyes tired. I do not much care what three people do in the privacy of their own home. It is a hard country, and folks find comfort where they can. But I cannot ignore the law, and I cannot let a mob run my town. He took a long sip of coffee and then set the cup down. So, this is the way it is. You have to make a decision.
Send the girl back with Cain. Send the widow back to her family's care. I do not care which, but you cannot keep both. The town will not stand for it. I will not stand for it. You have until the end of the week." When he had gone, the silence he left behind was filled with despair. Mercy was trembling, her face a mask of white terror. "I will run," she whispered. "I can disappear again." "No!" Clara's voice was sharp, furious. "There will be no more running. This is our home. How dare they? How dare they come here and pass judgment and try to tear us apart?" Her hands were clenched into fists, her eyes blazing with a righteous anger. Eli looked at their faces, at Mercy's terror and Clara's fury. He felt the weight of their world on his shoulders. The ghosts of his past whispered to him, reminding him of all the people he had failed to protect. He would not fail them. "I will go to the sheriff," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I will tell him the girl is here against her will, that I forced her to stay. I will turn myself in. It will buy you time. Time for you both to get away." "No, Eli," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "That is not a solution. That is a sacrifice, and we will not have it." "There is another way," Mercy said, her voice small but clear. All eyes turned to her. The terror was still in her face, but something else was there too, a spark of the fierce, desperate cunning that had helped her survive. "I heard the men in town talking once, about the preacher in the next county, Reverend Michael. They say he is an odd one. They say he keeps secrets. They say he believes that God's law is not always the same as man's law." She looked from Clara to Eli, her idea a wild, impossible gamble. What if we went to him? What if we got married? The word hung in the air, absurd and beautiful. The journey to the next county was a silent, desperate ride. They traveled at night, avoiding the main roads. The air was cold, and the moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky. They found the preacher in a small, clapboard chapel at the edge of a sleeping town, the paint peeling, the steeple leaning just slightly, like a man weary of his own piety. Reverend Michael was an old man, thin as a rail, with a cascade of white hair and eyes that were as kind and as ancient as the hills. They had seen too much of human folly to be shocked by anything. He listened to their story, the whole tangled, impossible truth of it, without interruption, his hands steepled under his chin. When they had finished, he was silent for a long time, looking at their three faces, etched with fear and hope in the dim lamplight of his study. "The law of man is a clumsy thing," he said at last, his voice a soft, papery rustle. "It tries to draw straight lines in a world that is all curves and circles, and the love of God is a mystery that I have given up trying to understand." He rose slowly to his feet. "Come," he said. He led them into the small, cold chapel. There were no flowers, no music. The only light came from a single candle he placed on the altar. There would be no papers filed, no witnesses to sign a register. This was a ceremony for them, and for God, and for no one else. He had them stand before him, their hands clasped together, Eli's large, rough hand holding both Clara's and Mercy's smaller ones. He did not read from the usual scripture. Instead, he spoke to them in a low, quiet voice. He spoke of hardship and of finding shelter in one another. He spoke of the world's cruelty and of the radical act of choosing kindness. He had them speak their own quiet vows, simple words that were not about obeying or honoring in the traditional sense, but about protecting, about sheltering, about standing together as one against the storm. When it was done, he raised a hand in blessing. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "By the grace of a God who understands more than we do, I recognize the bond you have made here." He looked them in the eyes, one by one. "There is no piece of paper that will make this right in the eyes of the world. Marriage is not a word. It is a promise you live every day. It is what you make of it. So make it good." They rode back to the ranch under a sky bruised with the promise of morning. The quiet vows they had spoken in the frost-bitten chapel, a fragile, fierce thing held between them. The ceremony had changed nothing and everything. No law in the land would recognize their bond. But in their own hearts, a new truth had been forged. They were not just three survivors clinging to a single raft. They were a crew, bound by a shared oath. The cabin, when they reached it, felt different. It was no longer just a temporary shelter from the storm of the world. It was a fortress, their fortress, consecrated by a promise made in the dark. A new strength settled in them, not the brittle defiance of before, but the deep, quiet resilience of a tree that is bent in the wind and not broken. But peace, on the frontier, was a currency quickly spent. The quiet lasted less than a week. The first harbinger of the coming storm was not the thunder of a lynch mob, but the arrival of a single man in Bitter Creek. Silas Kane rode into town with the greasy confidence of a man who believes the world owes him something and is not afraid to collect with interest. He was a big man, running to fat with a thick neck and small, greedy eyes that missed nothing. He did not go to the sheriff. He went to the saloon. Over cheap whiskey, he told his story, his voice a low growl that carried to every corner of the smoky room. He spoke of his young, flighty wife, Mercy, who had been addled by grief after the loss of their non-existent child. He painted a picture of a concerned husband, worried sick over her disappearance. He showed the men at the bar a set of papers, expertly forged, a marriage certificate and a document signed by Mercy's father, a bill of sale disguised as a dowry agreement. He spoke of the bounty hunter he had hired, and how the man had tracked his poor, lost wife to a ranch owned by a corrupter of women, a man named Dawson. At the same time, Samuel Thompson began his crusade. He stood on the steps of the town's small church after the Sunday service and delivered a sermon of his own, his voice booming with moral outrage. He spoke of his gentle, departed brother, and the black-hearted widow who had driven him to his grave and then fled into the arms of a sinner. He painted Eli as a corrupter, a spider at the center of a web of depravity, luring innocent women to his lair. He called the ranch an abomination, a moral rot that, if left unchecked, would poison the entire community. He called upon the good, God-fearing folk of Bitter Creek to rise up and cleanse their county of this filth. The two stories, Silas's tale of a stolen wife and Samuel's sermon of righteous fury, acted like a lit match on a trail of gunpowder. The town, already simmering with suspicion and self-righteousness, began to boil. The fear of what was different, the petty jealousies, the grim satisfaction of seeing another man's life torn down. It all coalesced into a single, ugly purpose. That evening, they came. The trio saw them from the cabin window first, a collection of bobbing lanterns moving up the valley in the twilight, a slow, inexorable tide of hatred. It was not a posse with a legal claim. It was a mob. A low, ugly murmur grew louder as they approached, the sound of dozens of angry voices blending into a single, menacing growl. Eli's face became a mask of cold fury. The ghosts of the war, never far from the surface, rose in his eyes. He had seen this before, this fever that turns neighbors into monsters. "Clara, Mercy," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Go to the root cellar. Bar the door from the inside. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Mercy, her face as white as bleached bone, grabbed Clara's arm. "We have to run," she whispered, her old instinct to flee taking over. "Out the back. We can make it to the trees." "There is no more running," Eli said. He took his rifle down from the wall, its familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands. He checked the action, his movements economical and precise. "This is our home. They will not take it." But Clara pulled away from Mercy and walked to stand beside Eli. She placed a hand on the rifle, her touch gentle but firm. "No, Eli," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "This is not a battle you can win with a gun. You will kill one of them, maybe two, and they will kill you. And then what becomes of us?" "I will not let them touch you," he growled, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "They will not touch us," she said, her gaze fixed on the approaching lights.
Because I will not let them. Before he could stop her, she turned, unlatched the cabin door, and stepped out onto the porch, alone. The mob, now just 50 yards away, slowed to a halt, surprised by the sight of the lone, defiant woman. They were a shifting mass of bodies, their faces hard and anonymous in the flickering lamplight. Clara could see Samuel Thompson and Silas Kane near the front, stoking the flames. Eli and Mercy watched in horror from the doorway. Eli raised the rifle, ready to fire at the first man who took another step. Clara raised her hands, not in surrender, but to ask for silence. "I know why you are here," she called out, her voice carrying in the still night air with a surprising strength. "I know what you have been told. I know what you call me. And I know you have come here tonight believing you are doing God's work." A man in the crowd shouted, "You are an adulteress and a whore!" And others took up the cry. Clara waited for the jeers to die down, her posture unbowed. "You can call me whatever names you wish," she said when it was quiet again. "The world has been calling women names since the beginning of time, but I will tell you who I am. I am a woman who was a wife to a man who found more comfort in a bottle than in my arms. I am a woman whose grief was called a crime by the very people who should have offered me comfort." She took a step forward, to the edge of the porch. "Shame is a cold bedfellow, and I have slept with it for many years, but I will not be shamed by you, not tonight." Her eyes found Samuel Thompson in the crowd. "You speak of sin. Let me speak of salvation. I came to this place a broken thing, with nothing left to my name but the judgment in your eyes. This man," she gestured back toward the cabin door where Eli stood, "a stone sentinel, offered me shelter. He asked for nothing in return. He offered me a place by his fire. He offered me his protection." Her gaze swept across the crowd, across the hard, uncertain faces. "And this girl," she said, her voice softening, "this girl you would see return to a man who bought her like a piece of livestock. She came to us near death. We took her in. We cared for her. We found in her a spirit that a cruel world had tried, and failed, to extinguish." Tears were now streaming down her face, but her voice did not falter. "You see sin here? I see a miracle. I see 3 people, lost and alone, who found a family in each other. We have built a life here, not out of lust, but out of a desperate need to survive. This is a house built on kindness, not corruption. This is a love that asks for nothing but your survival. If that is a sin in your eyes, then I will stand before God and answer for it myself, but I will not answer for it to you." A profound silence fell over the crowd. Her words, so simple and so raw, had struck a chord of truth that their manufactured rage could not entirely drown out. A few men at the back of the mob, farmers who knew the hardship of the land and the sting of loneliness, lowered their pitchforks and began to shuffle away. Others looked at each other, the certainty in their faces beginning to waver. Samuel Thompson opened his mouth to speak, to reignite the fury, but the moment had passed. Clara had not fought them. She had shamed them with their own humanity. A few spat on the ground at her feet, their hatred too ingrained to be moved by a woman's tears, but many more just stood in a state of confused silence. It was then that Sheriff Brody rode up, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He had been following the mob at a distance, hoping it would burn itself out. "All right," he called, his voice carrying the weary weight of the law. "That is enough. Go home, all of you." He dismounted and walked through the parting crowd to the foot of the porch. He looked up at Clara, then at Eli in the doorway. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. "Whatever you 3 are," he said, his voice low enough so only they could hear, "it is not illegal, just hard for folks to stomach. The charges of theft are dropped for lack of evidence." He looked pointedly at Silas Kane. "And this writ you have is a matter for a judge in a proper courtroom, not a mob in a field." Silas Kane, seeing his power over the crowd evaporate, let out a roar of pure frustration. The law would not help him. The mob would not help him. He would help himself.
with a sudden, brutal movement. He lunged forward, pushing past the sheriff, and scrambled onto the porch. "She is mine!" he bellowed, his face a mask of rage as he grabbed for Mercy, who shrieked and stumbled backward. Eli lunged forward to intercept him, and Clara threw herself between Silas and the girl. In the chaotic scuffle, Silas shoved Clara hard against the cabin wall. The sight of Clara being hurt, of this brute laying his hands on her, broke something in Mercy. The years of terror, the nights of abuse, the constant running, it all coalesced into a single, clarifying point of pure, cold rage. She did not scream again. While Silas was tangled with Eli, she darted back into the cabin and snatched up the pistol Eli kept on the mantelpiece. It was a heavy, unfamiliar weight in her hand. She came back out onto the porch just as Silas threw Eli to the ground. He turned, his eyes wild, and reached for her again. The deafening crack of the pistol shot silenced everything. The wind, the crickets, the very heartbeats of the men in the field. Silas Kane stood frozen for a second, a look of comical surprise on his face. Then he looked down at his leg, where a dark stain was already blossoming on his trousers, just above the knee. He let out a howl of pain and collapsed onto the porch, clutching his shattered leg. Mercy stood there, trembling violently, the gun smoking in her hand. It was still pointed at the man writhing on the ground. The world seemed to rush in on her, the noise and the colors too bright, too loud. Eli was on his feet in an instant. He did not go to Silas. He went to Mercy. He gently took the heavy pistol from her trembling fingers and then wrapped her in his coat, pulling her tight against his chest, shielding her from the sight of the man and the stares of the crowd. "It is over," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "It is all over now. You are safe." Sheriff Brody holstered his shotgun and walked slowly up the steps, his face impassive. He looked at the moaning man on the porch, then at the terrified girl being held in Eli's arms. He nudged Silas with the toe of his boot. "Looks to me like you were trespassing," he said, his voice dry. "And you assaulted 2 people on their own property, and from what I hear, you had it coming for a long time." He looked back at his deputy. "Get a wagon. We will take this trash to the doctor, and then to a cell." He looked at Mercy one last time, a flicker of something almost like respect in his tired eyes. "I do not think we will be pressing any charges here." That night, long after the last of the mob had dispersed and the only sounds were the crickets and the whisper of the wind, the 3 of them sat in silence before the hearth. The fire cast a warm, dancing light on their faces. The storm had passed. They had faced the world, and they had not broken. A new peace settled over the cabin, a quiet that was not empty, but full. It was filled with the weight of what had been endured and overcome. It was a peace that had been earned. They had built it themselves, out of the ashes of their old lives, and it was stronger than any stone or timber. It was home. Time is a river that carves its own path through the hardest stone, and on the plains of Wyoming, it flowed with a slow, inexorable force. The seasons turned, each one a new chapter in the story of the ranch. The brutal white of winter gave way to a spring of improbable green, the prairie bursting forth with wildflowers that seemed a miracle after the long cold. Summer came in a blaze of heat and dust, the days long and filled with the hum of insects and the lowing of cattle. Then autumn, the season of reckoning, painted the cottonwoods by the creek in shades of gold and fire, a final, glorious breath before the land slept again. With the turning of the seasons, the ranch began to flourish. It was no longer just a place of survival. It was becoming a place of life. Clara, with hands that had once trembled with grief, tilled a small patch of earth near the cabin. She coaxed life from the stubborn soil, planting rows of beans, squash, and corn. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could feel the pulse of the earth, a rhythm of planting and tending and harvesting that mirrored the healing in her own soul. The first time she served a meal where everything on their plates, The roasted chicken, the boiled potatoes, the sweet corn, had come from their own land. A quiet, profound pride settled in the room. While Clara tended the earth, Mercy tended her own mind. The angry, defensive shell she had worn for so long began to fall away, revealing a sharp, hungry intellect. By the light of the fire in the evenings, with Clara's patient guidance, the black squiggles in the Bible slowly transformed themselves into words, and the words into stories. Learning to read was like being given a key to 1,000 locked doors. It was an act of profound self-possession. For the first time in her life, she was not just reacting to the world. She was beginning to understand it, to find her own place within its narratives. She was no longer just a girl who had been sold. She was a woman who was claiming her own story, one letter at a time. Eli, in turn, opened his world to them. He had always seen the ranch as his solitary burden, but now it became a shared enterprise. He taught them what he knew. His voice, once clipped and functional, now patient and steady. He taught them how to ride fence, to spot a break in the wire, to mend it with deft twists of their wrists. He taught them the subtle language of the livestock, how to tell a sick calf from a healthy one, how to calm a spooked horse with a low voice and a steady hand. He took them to the stockyards in the next town over, a place of noise and men and sharp dealings, and he taught them how to trade, how to look a buyer in the eye and demand a fair price, how to stand their ground. He was not just giving them skills, he was giving them independence. He was ensuring that, with or without him, they would never be helpless again. Their love, born in the crucible of a winter storm and consecrated in a quiet chapel, settled into the comfortable rhythm of daily life. It was not a grand, dramatic passion, but 1,000 small, ordinary moments that, woven together, created a fabric of extraordinary strength. It was in the soft kiss Eli would press to Clara's temple as she handed him his coffee in the pre-dawn dark. It was in the shared, conspiratorial laughter between Clara and Mercy as they plucked chickens for supper, their hands a flurry of motion. It was in the way Mercy would leave a piece of her freshly baked pie on Eli's pillow when he came in late and exhausted from a long day on the range. The complexities did not simply vanish. There were still moments of friction, echoes of their old wounds. One afternoon, Eli was showing Clara how to handle his new rifle, his hands over hers on the stock, his body close to hers as he explained how to sight down the barrel. It was a moment of quiet, focused instruction, a teacher and a student. Mercy, mending a shirt on the porch, looked up and saw them, their heads close together. Their world momentarily shrunk to the space of the rifle, a familiar, cold pang of exclusion. A ghost of the girl she had been in the barn went through her. She felt the sudden, sharp fear of being the third, the outsider. Clara must have felt the shift in the air. Without turning, she called out, her voice warm and easy. "Mercy, come and try. Eli says you have a sharper eye than both of us put together. I wager you could hit that fence post from here." Eli turned, a slow smile spreading across his face. "She is right," he said, holding the rifle out to Mercy. "Your turn." The moment of jealousy, so sharp and painful, dissolved into a warm rush of belonging. She was not the outsider. She was a part of this, an essential part. She took the rifle, its weight solid and real in her hands, and with their guidance, she took her aim. The quiet jealousy had been met not with anger or dismissal, but with an act of deliberate, loving reassurance. The world outside the ranch continued to present its own struggles. A harsh spring blizzard took 3 of their newborn calves. A summer drought withered a portion of Clara's corn crop. But these were the struggles of the land, the honest, impartial challenges of the frontier. They were not the cruel, manufactured judgments of men. They faced these new hardships together, as a unit. When the calves were lost, they sat together in the barn, their shared grief a silent comfort. When the corn withered, they worked together to salvage what they could,
their shared labor a testament to their resilience. Slowly, grudgingly, the town of Bitter Creek began to change. The scandal did not disappear overnight, but it began to fade, like a bloodstain washed by many rains. The first crack in the wall of their ostracism came from an unlikely source: the baker's wife, a woman who had once pulled her children away from Clara in the street, got her wagon wheel stuck in the thick mud of the spring thaw, not a quarter-mile from their turnoff. Eli and the women came upon her, and without a word of reproach for past slights, they put their shoulders to the wheel and pushed her out, getting covered in mud for their efforts. The next week, the baker's wife stopped by the ranch. She did not speak of the incident. She simply said, "I hear you have eggs to sell, Mrs. Thompson." She bought a dozen, her eyes averted. But the transaction was a treaty, a small, fragile bridge built across a chasm of judgment. Others followed. A few men, seeing the way Eli's herd was growing fat and healthy, began to stop him on the road to ask his advice about cattle. The blacksmith, a man who respected hard work above all else, started to greet him with a slow, deliberate nod. They were not invited to the church socials, and the women still whispered behind their hands when Clara and Mercy came to the mercantile. But the raw, open hostility was gone, replaced by a kind of wary, reluctant acceptance. They were strange. They were different, but they were survivors. And on the frontier, survival was a virtue that was hard to argue with. One evening, Clara sat at the table with a pen and a precious sheet of paper. She was writing to her sister in the East, the first letter she had written in over a year. She filled the page with the details of her new life: the garden, the cattle, the vastness of the sky. Then, with a hand that was steady and sure, she told the truth. "You may hear stories about me," she wrote. "You may hear that I have fallen into a life of sin. Do not believe them. I have fallen into a life of grace. I share my home and my heart with a good, quiet man and a brave, fierce young woman who is as dear to me as a daughter. The world may not have a name for what we are to each other, but we do. We are a family. We are not sinners. We are survivors who chose each other. And I have never, in all my days, known such peace." Not long after, Eli took his sharpest knife and spent an entire evening by the fire, carving. He worked with a slow, focused intensity, the shavings of wood falling at his feet. When he was done, he stood on a chair and held the piece of wood up to the thick, central beam above the hearth. There, where the firelight would touch it every night, he nailed his creation, carved into the dark wood. In deep, plain letters were 3 names: Eli, Clara, Mercy. It was his own quiet letter to the world, a permanent, unshakable declaration of who they were. The true test came in the fall, when the town held its annual harvest dance in the Grange Hall. It was the social event of the year, a night of fiddles and laughter and a brief respite from the toil of the land. "We should go," Mercy said one evening, her voice a mixture of daring and fear. Clara looked at Eli, a question in her eyes. To go would be a bold, public statement. It would be an act of walking willingly into the lion's den. Eli looked at the names he had carved above the hearth, and then at the 2 women who were his life. "Get your good dresses ready," he said, a slow smile touching his lips. "We will go." When they walked into the Grange Hall that night, the fiddle music faltered for a moment. A wave of silence rippled through the room. Every head turned to watch them. They were a sight to behold. Eli, clean-shaven and wearing his best coat, looking taller and stronger than any man in the room. Clara, in a simple dark blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her head held high with a quiet, unassailable dignity. And Mercy, in a calico dress Clara had helped her sew, her face flushed with nervousness but her eyes shining with a defiant light. The whispers started immediately, a rustle of judgment that spread through the crowd like a dry wind. People stared, some with open hostility, others with a prurient curiosity. But then, something else happened. The blacksmith,
who was standing by the punch bowl, raised his cup to Eli in a silent toast. The baker's wife offered Clara a small, tight smile. A few of the younger folk, who were less invested in the rigid morality of their elders, simply saw a handsome man and two beautiful women, and they smiled, intrigued. The fiddler, seeing that the world had not ended, struck up a lively tune, and the dancing resumed. They did not dance. They did not need to. Their presence was statement enough. They were there, together, boldly, and they were not hiding anymore. The final scene of their story was not written in a crowded hall, but on their own porch. A few nights later, a summer thunderstorm, a magnificent, terrifying spectacle of the plains, was rolling in from the west. The sky was a canvas of bruised purple and angry gray, shot through with sudden, brilliant veins of lightning. The air was thick with the clean, electric smell of ozone and the rich, earthy scent of rain on dry ground. They sat together on the porch swing, the three of them, a comfortable, familiar weight. They did not speak, but watched the approaching storm, a shared awe in their silence. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the cottonwoods and carrying the first cool drops of rain. Clara leaned her head against Eli's shoulder, a gesture of complete and easy trust. Mercy, sitting on her other side, reached out and took Clara's free hand, her fingers lacing through Clara's in a gesture of simple, profound connection. Eli looked out at the vast, wild sky, at the raw and untamed power of the world. He felt Clara's weight against him and the warmth of mercy beside her. The ghosts that had haunted him for so long were finally quiet, banished by the steady, living presence of these two women. He spoke softly, his voice barely more than a whisper against the rising wind. I was alone before. Now I am not. That is all the truth I need. And under that wild western sky, the ranch held three hearts that beat as one. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. And we invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.